Hello. Today we're going to talk about the digestive system. So the digestive system is made up of two primary components. The first thing that is really obvious is that it is made up of the gastrointestinal tract. This is a long continuous tube that starts at the mouth, the oral cavity, and it winds its way throughout the body, becoming various structures, but it's all a single continuous tube. So we call this part the esophagus, and then it gets to the stomach, and that leads into the small intestine, which then leads into the large intestine. And then the end of the tube, the GI tract, is an opening called the anal cavity or anal canal. So we've got two openings, one at the oral cavity and the other at the anal canal leading out to the anus. The other major component of the digestive system are the accessory structures. So these are organs that are not a part of the GI tract, but they aid in digestion. So if we look at this picture, it would include things like the salivary glands, the liver, which produces bile, which gets put into the GI tract to get mixed in with the food particles, the gallbladder, the pancreas. And so all of these different supportive structures help with digestion. Here is another picture showing these two major components. And so you've got those accessory organs, the salivary glands, the liver. We notice that none of these structures are actually a part of the GI tract. Okay. And then we've got the GI tract, which is this long continuous tube that winds its way throughout the body with two openings, one at the oral cavity and the other at the anus. So what are the functions of the digestive system? Well, obviously it begins with ingesting food, right? Putting in food in our mouth and starting to manipulate that food. So this occurs at the oral cavity. Another major function of the digestive system is secretion. And so this is done with the help of all of those accessory organs. The salivary glands secrete saliva, and saliva helps to lubricate and moisten our food. It helps to make sure that it's easier for us to grind down the food particles. The stomach produces things like hydrochloric acid and various enzymes. The liver produces bile, which helps with breaking down the fats that we eat. Another major function is mixing and propulsion. And so when the secretions are mixed in with the food, there has to be a lot of churning going on to make sure that the food particles are uniformly mixed with the secretions. And then we are going to propel the food particles in a specific direction. We're going to propel it down through the GI tract. Digestion is a very important function of the digestive system, and there are two major types of digestion. Initially, when we grind our food down with our teeth, right? When we lubricate the food, we are doing what is called mechanical digestion. So mechanical digestion is going to ensure that the food particles are broken down, are ground down properly. And then the more important type of digestion is chemical digestion. And this is where we break down the chemical bonds that are holding the carbohydrates together, that are holding the proteins together. So we're trying to break down those chemical bonds so that eventually we will end up with basic subunits, the building blocks of our food, things like amino acids and things like individual simple sugars. And those little monomers, those little basic building blocks can now undergo absorption. And so absorption is where these tiny building blocks are small enough and they're able to get absorbed into our blood, and the blood is going to transport those building blocks to our cells, which will use them for making energy, for making ATP, so that we can continue to live and do metabolic processes. This primarily occurs in the small intestine. The small intestine is about 18 to 20 feet long. And so all of that surface area helps to ensure that there is very effective absorption. Okay, so about 90% of all absorption occurs in the small intestine. And then finally, things that are not absorbable, things that are not considered to be nutrients. Perhaps we didn't have enzymes to break down those particular material. And so those things are then considered to be waste products, and they get compacted, they get stored, and then they are gotten rid of out of the body through a process called defecation. So this occurs as the fecal material comes out of the large intestine, out through the rectum, and then finally through the anus. If you look at any part of the GI tract, it could be the esophagus, it could be the small intestine, the large intestine, and we do a cross-section view, we'll see that there are some basic standard layers. And so the GI tract is made up of 4 primary layers. Food travels through the lumen, and so here's the lumen. And the innermost layer is called the mucosa layer. Just like the name suggests, this is a layer that is going to be secreting mucus. And mucus is a sticky substance. It is often alkaline or basic. And so it helps to coat the lining of the lumen to protect the lumen from microbes. If there are extremely acidic contents within the lumen, it helps to protect the inner lining of that lumen. Okay, so the mucosa. The next layer out is called the submucosa. And so here is the submucosa, made up of blood vessels, connective tissue, and it is going to help to connect the mucosa to the next layer, which is going to be the muscularis. The muscularis is made up of smooth muscle. There are 2 layers. The inner layer is a circular layer, and then the outer layer is longitudinal. So they run perpendicular to one another. And when both of these layers of muscles contract at the same time, it helps to do what is called peristalsis. Peristalsis is, let me write that word here. So peristalsis is a type of propulsion that moves things in one direction, okay, and that's going to be inferiorly. And it is like, it creates a wave-like contraction, kind of like what happens when we squeeze a toothpaste tube from the bottom up, okay? So you're squeezing and you can see that bolus of, that ball of toothpaste moving up, propelling its way upward, okay? And so that is essentially what the muscularis layer does. It helps to propel the food particles. And so throughout our GI tract, we have these 2 layers. There is one exception, and that is within the stomach. The stomach, because it is a J-shaped, very enlarged structure, it actually needs a 3rd layer to be effective in propelling and mixing. And so that 3rd layer is called the oblique layer. So we'll mention that when we get to the stomach. The outermost layer, the 4th layer, is called the serosa. And the serosa is areolar connective tissue, epithelium, and it's there to protect the outer part of the GI tract. It's also there to anchor the GI tract to other organs, other structures like blood vessels and so on. Okay. All right, so that's the serosa. This picture also shows a couple of other things that we won't go into in much detail, but within our gut, okay, within our digestive system, we have nerve fibers, we have neurons and so on that specifically control digestion. So sometimes they call this the gut brain, right? And so the gut brain, the nervous system of the digestive system, is called the enteric nervous system. And the enteric nervous system has two major nerve groupings. They're called nerve plexus. And so one nerve plexus is a submucosal nerve plexus, and the other one is called the myenteric nerve plexus. The submucosal nerve plexus is responsible for controlling and regulating glandular secretions, like hydrochloric acid and mucus secretions and so on. And the myenteric plexus is responsible for movement, for propulsion. Okay, it initiates motility within the GI tract. So let's begin at the beginning of our GI tract, the oral cavity. So the oral cavity is where we find our teeth. It's where we find the lips, we find the tongue with its taste buds. We have up at the roof portion, we have the hard palate, which will be a hard structure that keeps the food in, right? Contains, it provides support for the roof of the mouth. We have the soft palate and the uvula. And the function of these structures is it aids in swallowing. When we swallow, the soft palate and the uvula will come up and it will block off the nasopharynx, which is the part of the throat that is responsible just for breathing. And so we don't want food and fluid to get into our nasal cavity. And so the soft palate and the uvula helps to block off that area. We have various tonsils. We have the palatine tonsils. There's, this picture doesn't show it, but we have lingual tonsils as well. And the tonsils are part of our lymphatic immune system, and they represent the first line of defense for things that are ingested through the mouth. And so it helps to break down bacterial walls, weaken those walls so that they can be further destroyed within the body, okay, within the GI tract. We've got the tongue, okay, which contains our taste buds, a lingual frenulum, which is a thin fold that helps to anchor and stabilize the tongue. We've got the vestibule and the lip, okay, and obviously the teeth, right? So 32 teeth. Let's talk about our teeth. We've got 32 adult teeth, and whatever we have on the top, we have on the bottom. And so, on the top or bottom, this is half of them. We have 8 incisors. Okay, so 8 incisors. So here they are. We've got 4 canines. Sorry, this is the total. Okay, so 8 incisors, 4 canines, 8 premolars, and 6 molars. Does that add up? Yes. Okay. All right. So here are the incisors. Okay, and the function of the incisors is to make contact with our food, to bite down on the food. We have canines. Okay, and the canines are the sharpest teeth. So on the top side, here's one canine, here's the other, and whatever we have on the top, we have on the bottom. So 4 canines total. And the function of the canines is to grab onto our food so that we can tear easily. So these are the sharpest teeth. These are the ones that are designed for tearing, for an omnivorous diet, eating meat as well as vegetables. Okay, so very sharp teeth. And then we've got premolars and the molars. So they are very similar to one another. Premolars and molars work to grind the food. They're fairly flat, and they just help to break down the food and make sure that it's sufficiently mechanically broken down. So our teeth, the structure of a single tooth is that it has 3 primary regions. It's got a crown, okay, this top part that we can see. It's got a neck, which is the transition between the crown and the lower part, which is embedded, okay, in our gum. The gum is called the gingiva, and our tooth, each tooth is covered by enamel, which is the hardest substance in the body. It is made up primarily of calcium phosphate, So it is a crystallized material called hydroxyapatite, and it just helps to cover and protect the tooth. Below that, you have your dentin or dentine, and this is calcified tissue which has nerve endings. It's got thousands of nerve endings, and it is extremely sensitive. And so if you ever have a situation where the dentin is exposed, right, the tooth has broken, you've broken the crown, tooth is broken, and that exposes the dentin to the environment. Dentin is going to be extremely sensitive to any kind of movement, pressure, hot, cold, gives us that enormous sensitivity. And then below that, we've got the pulp. And so this pulp is living connective tissue. It's got blood vessels, it's got nerve endings, and so on. All right, salivary glands. We have 3 types of salivary glands. So these are also accessory organs, accessory structures that help with digestion. And so these salivary glands, the first one is the parotid salivary gland, and the next one is under the tongue, so we call it the sublingual salivary gland, and then under the mandible, submandibular salivary gland. And these glands are exocrine glands. They secrete saliva, and so we know that all exocrine glands have a duct, and the duct bears the name of the gland. So you have your parotid duct, you've got a submandibular duct, and this picture is not showing the sublingual duct, but these little things are the sublingual duct, right? And so the saliva is produced by the gland, and then it gets released into the duct, and the duct then releases the saliva into our oral cavity. So these are exocrine glands, and the function of saliva is to moisten our food, to lubricate the food particles. Saliva has a lot of mucus in it, which helps with that lubrication and moistening. Saliva also has 2 important enzymes. The first one is salivary amylase. And salivary amylase's job is to break down starch. So this is chemical digestion, right? Because starch is it's a carbohydrate. And now amylase is going to come in and start the process of breaking down those starch compounds. So what that means is if you are chewing things and you keep things in your mouth, let's say you chew a piece of bread, you keep it in your mouth long enough, you're going to start tasting sweetness, because amylase, if it's given enough time, it will break down that starch into simple sugars, okay? The other thing that is in our saliva are a group of enzymes that are called lysozymes. And lysozymes weaken bacterial walls, okay? So they help to break down the walls of various microbes and bacteria that are found in our food, right? We have lots of them in our food. And so they are, going to weaken the bacteria so that as things get ingested, those bacteria are now, susceptible to further degradation and sterilization and destruction. All right, so once we start moistening the food and we push the food back to the back of the throat, we begin the process of swallowing, okay? And so the process of swallowing is, while it's in the mouth, it is a voluntary process, but once we push it back to the oral pharynx, the back of the throat, to the oral pharynx, it now becomes an involuntary reflex. And so, like I said earlier, the palate. So here's the hard palate right there, and then posterior to the hard palate, you have the soft palate, and then the uvula is at the edge of it. So the soft palate and the uvula elevates to block off the nasopharynx from receiving food or fluid, okay? And so as a result, the food travels to the oral pharynx, and then it gets propelled down into past the laryngeal pharynx and down into the esophagus. And what ensures that this happens is the epiglottis, which is this structure here, will come down and it will cover off the glottis to prevent food from going into our trachea. Okay, so it pushes that food into the esophagus instead. All right, this is a back view showing the epiglottis or the epiglottic cartilage. And so that's its primary function, which is to guard the airways to ensure that things don't go down the wrong pipe, as it were. All right, so now you've got this bolus of food, right? It's, you know, mixed in, it's lubricated, it's this, you know, this not digested yet, but it's kind of a, you know, a soupy mix, right? And so it is going to travel down the esophagus, which is just a muscular tube to propel the food particles down. And as it leaves the esophagus, it is going to go through a little, it's going to pass through a little muscular structure, which we call a sphincter. Okay, and so there are several sphincters along the GI tract. And so there is a sphincter right at the junction between the esophagus and the stomach. Okay, so we're going to take a look at that sphincter. The other place where you have a sphincter along the esophagus is up at the superior border of the esophagus. So between the esophagus and the pharynx. Okay, so you've got an upper esophageal sphincter and a lower esophageal sphincter. We're not seeing the upper esophageal sphincter, but the lower one is right there. All right, and so the job of the sphincters in the GI tract, okay, there are two major functions. One major function, and let me just repeat that one more time, what sphincters are muscular structures. And so they have the ability to kind of close down on the opening, close down on the lumen, right? And shut completely. And then kind of open up and relax a little bit and relax a little bit more. And so one major function of these sphincters is to, when they close, is to prevent things from going back up. Okay, so it ensures that particles move downward, move in a specific direction. So when things go up the wrong way, we call it a reflux condition. Kind of like you probably heard of acid reflux disorder, right? When people have, it's called GERD or acid reflux. And so a reflux is simply movement of material up the wrong way. So if things go from the esophagus into the stomach, we don't want those food particles to leave the stomach and go back up into the esophagus. Okay, so the sphincters help to ensure that that doesn't happen. The other thing that sphincters do in the GI tract is it helps to regulate the rate of passage of things across that sphincter. Sometimes we want things to get released slowly into the next structure. We don't want it to just freely get released. And so we want to regulate the movement, the rate of movement. And so those sphincters help to do that. Okay, so two primary reasons for having these sphincters. And so we've got one at the top part of the esophagus. Is called the upper esophageal sphincter. And here we see the lower esophageal sphincter. Now, the lower esophageal sphincter has two other names. And so let's see if I can just draw the esophagus. So you got the esophagus there, and then you've got the stomach, okay? So that little sphincter right there, that is our lower esophageal sphincter. But it has two other names, and one other name that it has reflects the fact that it is found right at the beginning of the stomach. So this portion of the stomach right here is called the cardia of the stomach. And so the other name for this sphincter is the cardiac sphincter. Okay, so that very first part of the stomach is the cardia of the stomach. And then the third name for this sphincter reflects the fact that it is found between the esophagus and the stomach. The word for stomach is gastro or gastric, right? And so the third name is the gastroesophageal sphincter. If you've heard of the condition GERD, right, this acid reflux disorder, which is what is commonly known as, but its actual name is GERD. GERD stands for gastroesophageal reflux disorder. And so when a person has GERD, they are oftentimes producing too much acid in their stomach, okay, too much hydrochloric acid. And because of this excess in hydrochloric acid, the contents of the stomach sometimes will push back against that cardiac sphincter and reflux up into the esophagus, therefore damaging the lining of the esophagus, causing a burning sensation, and then eventually, irreversibly damaging the esophagus, the lining of the esophagus. And so this condition is more than just, the occasional heartburn, okay, that we sometimes get. This is a serious disease where the esophagus gets severely damaged and inflamed, and it causes, chronic heartburn, chronic discomfort whenever people eat certain types of foods. All right, so that's GERD, and it's due to a weakening of this cardiac sphincter, and that allows the contents of the stomach to reflux back up into the esophagus. All right, so here is a cartoon image of the GI tract along with our accessory organs. And so where are we right now? Well, we just talked about the movement of that bolus of food, that ball of food material down the esophagus. It gets propelled down the esophagus by way of those muscularis layers, right? The inner circular muscles, the outer longitudinal muscles, causes wave-like contractions, and it propels the material into the esophagus. So there is a cardiac sphincter right there, okay? And then we have the stomach. So I want to just, focus in on the stomach just for a second. So let me see if I can draw. There's the esophagus, and then we've got all right, so that's kind of close. All right, so here's that cardiac sphincter. And now I want to talk about the 4 primary regions of the stomach. So we mentioned that this is the cardia of the stomach. That's the beginning part of the stomach that's going to receive food from the esophagus. This upper part here is called the fundus of the stomach. And its purpose is to store excess food. Okay, so the whole primary function of the stomach is to receive food, mix and churn that food with the contents of the secretions of the stomach. But sometimes if you eat a lot, right, the stomach is actually a huge reservoir. It can actually store an enormous amount of food because it has that particular shape, and it has inner folds which increase surface area within the stomach. And so the fundus is there to store excess food. Okay. The primary part that does the mixing and the churning, we call that the body of the stomach. And then the end of the stomach is an area called the pylorus. Okay, so those are the 4 primary regions of the stomach. And then when the pylorus ends, there is a sphincter, and that leads out into the first part of our small intestine. So you've got a sphincter right there that is going to control the passageway or control the rate of passage of things leaving the pylorus and entering into the small intestine. And so the first part of our small intestine is called the duodenum or duodenum. It's a little 10-inch segment. The initial part of our small intestine, okay? And so, so you've got a sphincter. That sphincter, by the way, is called the pyloric sphincter. All right. So within the stomach, let's show you another picture of the stomach. And so here is a picture showing a couple of things that we've kind of already talked about. So we have an innermost layer, a third layer of muscle, and that is called the oblique layer. Okay, and it's only found in the stomach, this oblique layer. And then you've got your circular layer, superficial to that, and superficial to that, we've got our longitudinal layer. Okay, and this makes it very efficient for the stomach to be able to mix, to churn food, to ensure that that bolus of food gets mixed in with all of the secretions of the stomach. Okay, which we'll get into in a second. And then if you look at the inner lining of the stomach, it's got these highly folded structures. And so I'm exaggerating the folds, but inside the stomach, you've got all of these folds, okay? And so those folds are called rugae. And they increase the surface area within the lumen of the stomach. Now, if we look closely at the rugae, look at it microscopically, we'll see that embedded in the rugae are additional microscopic folds. And so those folds kind of look like this. Okay, so these are even smaller folds. And those tiny little folds are called gastric pits. Okay, and there are cells found along the membrane of those gastric pits. And those cells are going to be responsible for producing various types of gastric secretions that will get dumped into the lumen of the stomach to get mixed in with the bolus of food. So after all is said and done, we're going to end up having this very acidic, soupy mixture that is going to be produced in the stomach, and that soupy mixture is going to be what leaves out of the pylorus and into the duodenum. Okay, so initially when we were, ingesting food, we called it food, right? You bite into food, and then as soon as you lubricate it with saliva, then we called it a bolus of food, right? So really a bolus. Okay, and then now that it's in the stomach, it's going to get mixed in with a lot of secretions, things like hydrochloric acid. Okay, and so now that soupy acidic mixture is no longer called food or a bolus, it is called chyme. And we are going to keep calling it chyme as this material leaves and travels throughout the rest of the GI tract. Okay, so as it goes into the small intestine, the large intestine is still going to be called chyme. Okay, the soupy acidic mixture. All right, so here is the inner lining of our stomach, okay? And if you look closely at that rugae, you're gonna see these convolutions, and so those are gastric pits, okay? And all of these are various cells that are found along the gastric pits. What kind of cells are they? Well, they are cells that produce mucus, so we call them mucus cells. There are cells in here that produce hydrochloric acid. There are cells that produce various enzymes that will help to break down proteins. All right, so our gastric secretions are going to be comprised of pepsinogen. Okay, pepsinogen is an inactive form of a protein or an enzyme called pepsin. Pepsin's job is to break down proteins, but these chief cells that are found along the gastric pits, they don't make pepsin, they make a precursor of pepsin, an inactive form of pepsin, okay? And so that inactive form is called ogen. Oftentimes when you see this word ogen, okay, that gives you a clue that it is an enzyme that is in its inactive form, okay? And it has to get converted into its active form. And so how do we convert pepsinogen into pepsin? Well, we also need hydrochloric acid. So hydrochloric acid is going to help convert the pepsinogen into pepsin. So hydrochloric acid is produced by the parietal cells. And in addition to converting pepsinogen into pepsin, it does several other things. Hydrochloric acid sterilizes our food. Okay, it helps to, so sterilizing includes things like destroying bacteria. Okay, in a extremely acidic environment, most of our bacterial species will not survive that low pH. It also helps to denature or break down proteins. Okay, all right, so it just produces this very sterile environment. All right, and so now that we have hydrochloric acid, we have successfully converted pepsinogen into pepsin, and pepsin's job is to break down proteins. So this is going to perform protein metabolism. We've got the mucus cells as well as goblet cells, and they secrete mucus. And the purpose of mucus is within the stomach, primarily to protect the inner lumen of the stomach from all of that acidity. So, you know, the stomach is constantly producing this very acidic, soupy mixture. And so we want to protect the stomach from, you know, kind of eating away at itself with all of that acidity. So mucus is just constantly being there to coat the lining of the stomach. And then the last thing that is produced by the parietal cells is a substance. It's like a coenzyme. It's called intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is made by the stomach, but it is going to leave the stomach and go out into the small intestine, where it is going to help with vitamin B12 absorption. So when we eat anything that contains vitamin B12, if you take vitamin B12 pills and it goes into your GI tract, we cannot absorb that vitamin B12 without intrinsic factor. Okay, so it's really critical. Vitamin B12 is responsible for red blood cell production, okay, among other things, helping with, you know, nervous system activities and so on. And so it is a very important vitamin, and we need it to be absorbable. All right, so here we are. We have made chyme, right? So chyme is extremely acidic. Chyme has a pH of about 2 or 3. Keep in mind, pH 7 is neutral. Oops, forgot the pH 7 is neutral. pH of anything greater than 7, so like 8 or 9, is considered to be basic. So you've got the scale going from 0 to 14. Anything under 7 is acidic. Anything over 7 is basic or alkaline. Okay, and so we've got that chyme, and it's now ready to leave the stomach and go out into the small intestine. So you've got the pylorus right in this region. Then we've got that pyloric sphincter, and then this whole segment here that I'm drawing in, that is the duodenum or duodenum. Okay, and so we're going to continue the process of chemical digestion in the duodenum. So the duodenum is going to receive that chyme, but the duodenum can't handle that acidic chyme very well. So the pyloric sphincter is going to help to release chyme very slowly into the duodenum. And then as soon as chyme enters into the duodenum, there has to be immediate action to neutralize the acidity of the chyme, to reduce the acidity of the chyme. Okay, and so we're going to enlist the help of 3 organs that you see here. The first one is the liver. The liver is going to produce bile, and bile is alkaline. Okay, and so that bile does other things, but it's alkaline. So it is going to, when it gets put into the duodenum, is going to help to reduce the acidity of the chyme. We have the gallbladder, which also stores bile, right? And so does a similar thing. And then the third organ is the pancreas. The pancreas produces various pancreatic enzymes, but it also produces something called bicarbonate. And bicarbonate is baking soda, right? So bicarbonate is alkaline, it's basic. And so you've got two things that will help to reduce the acidity of the chyme. Got bile coming from the liver and the gallbladder, and then we have bicarbonate coming from the pancreas. And these various secretions will get released. See that little green, those two green ducts right there? Okay, gets released into those ducts and into the duodenum to get mixed in with the chyme. Okay. In addition to neutralizing the acid, we are going to see that bile and pancreatic secretions have various enzymes and various substances that will help with chemical digestion. Okay, we're not done with chemical digestion. All of the chemical digestion did not get completed within the stomach. We did a little bit of protein breakdown in the stomach. We did a little bit of starch breakdown in the mouth with our salivary amylase, but that's it. We haven't broken down any lipids. We haven't really broken things down into their smallest components yet. And so the small intestine is going to, with the help of these other various accessory organs, the small intestine, it begins at the duodenum, and then the next part of it is the jejunum, the ileum, all of this 20 feet of small intestine is going to be primarily responsible for finishing up chemical digestion and beginning the absorption process, and then doing most of the absorption. About 90% of all absorption is going to end up occurring in the small intestine. Okay, so sounds like a lot. It is, it's a lot, right? So let's continue on. So here's the pancreas, and let's actually just take a break here, and I'll continue on in the next video, and we'll start with chyme leaving the pylorus, leaving the stomach and entering into the duodenum. So here's your pyloric sphincter, and we've got acidic chyme leaving the stomach. This is the pylorus of the stomach. It's going to pass through that sphincter and end up in the duodenum. And the next video, we'll talk about the involvement of bile, which sits up here, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, and what it does to help with chemical digestion. Okay, all right, so I'll stop here, keep this video a little shorter, and then we'll start up another one. See you later.